With Danny Coulombe gone, the Orioles will need a new number one lefty in their bullpen. And really, there are two good options, Cionel Pérez or Gregory Soto. But which one will take the top spot? Try to answer that question coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Wednesday, January 8th, 2025, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we are going to continue our Orioles player season review series for the 2024 campaign, looking at two hard-throwing, ground ball-driven left-handers in Cionel Pérez and Gregory Soto. I'll talk about each of their times with the Orioles in 2024, what went right and what went wrong. And then we'll look at the outlook for each of them heading into 2025. There is an opening for the number one go-to lefty spot. Which one of these guys will win it? Try to predict that out coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. So we're going to take a look at the seasons for Cionel Pérez, and Gregory Soto. This continues a series we've been doing really since the offseason began back in October for the Orioles, trying to break down the season of pretty much every single player on the Orioles 40-man roster who played for them in 2024. We're going to get to most of, if not all those guys between now and probably the start of spring training. And two lefties to talk about today. Two guys who you can kind of put in the same bunch because they do some of the same things well in Cionel Pérez and Gregory Soto, and are certainly both kind of fighting for a similar spot atop the lefties in this bullpen. So let's start with the season review for Cionel Pérez and start with what went right for Pérez in 2024. Well, in his age 28 season, he continued to do a lot of the things that he does best. His ground ball rate did go down a little bit. It was up at a fairly high 61%. It dropped down to around 56% in 2024, but that was still an elite number for Cionel Pérez. And that comes mostly from the usage of his sinker. Throws his sinker about 38% of the time. It's his most used pitch. Averages 96 miles an hour. We've seen him up to 98, 99 at times from the left side, and it's got good run on that pitch. That's why that sinker allows an average negative 6-degree launch angle. Basically, if somebody puts Cionel Pérez's sinker into play, generally it is going to be on the ground. Now, he did get a little better this year as well in terms of the batting average allowed. It was interesting, though. Opponents in 2023 hit 291 on his sinker. This year, they hit just 256. That's pretty good. But the underlying data showed that his expected batting average last year, 247, and this year, 265. This happens a lot to relievers because they just have a smaller sample size. Like, for example, Cionel Pérez threw 53 2/3 innings this year across 62 games. That is, I don't know, a couple of months for a starting pitcher. It's such a smaller sample size that numbers can get out of whack versus what the true talent should really be. But what we do know is he is hunting ground balls and he is getting ground balls. And along with that, he's not allowing a lot of hard contact. Now, his barrel rate was right around 5% this season for Pérez, which is very good, 89th percentile in baseball. It's not the 2.6% it was in 2023. That number almost doubled. That was like one of the best numbers in the league among relievers, but still great this year. And now barrel rate does get a little out of whack when you look at extreme ground ball pitchers, because to be considered a barrel, you got to hit it in kind of the perfect spot of the bat. And the launch angle for a barrel generally is a ball that's hit in the air. So for ground ball pitchers, they might have a low barrel rate, but sometimes could have a high hard hit rate. That is not the case for Cionel Pérez. With a 5% barrel rate, he posted a 34% hard hit rate, which is in the 84th percentile in baseball. Basically, not only was he elite at getting ground balls, but he was elite at getting soft ground balls. And those combinations generally lead to a lot of outs. And that is what we saw for stretches this year from Pérez. Now, the hard hit rate, it was still good last year at 42%, but to drop it to 34%, That's really the big difference between, again, the opponent's hitting, as I mentioned, about 290 on the sinker and bumping it down to 250. There's your big difference. Ground balls are harder to turn into hits, but hard ground balls sneak through the infield a lot more often than soft ground balls do. And that was why he was able to take a step forward, really, in that category this year. The 7.9% drop in hard hit rate, 15th biggest among all MLB pitchers from 2023 to 2024. And all of that, the high ground ball rates, the low hard hit rates, the low barrel rates, what does that mean? Well, you're less susceptible to giving up home runs because home runs need to be hit hard and need to be hit in the air generally. And if you're not allowing either of those things, you're not going to allow a lot of long balls. And for relievers, that can be especially huge because for starters, starting pitchers are going 5-6+ innings. If you allow a solo home run here, a 2-run shot there, it's not going to destroy your ERA. It's not going to destroy your entire outing. But if you're a reliever, especially one who comes in the middle of innings trying to get out of jams, and you have a home run problem, that can be a much, much larger issue. But for Cionel Pérez, it has not been an issue at all. We're not just talking about a low home run rate. Cionel Pérez in 2024 did not allow a single home run. You'll take that every day of the week. As I mentioned, 53 2/3 innings for Pérez in 62 appearances, did not allow a home run. And it's surprising that he still had a 4.53 ERA, which was his highest since joining the Orioles in 2022. Now, it came along with a 3.30 FIP. So in terms of the quality of contact that he was giving up, he had an ERA that was almost even more really than a run higher than it should have been. Even his expected ERA, 3.59. A lot of bad luck involved for Cionel Pérez this year. He paired a 19.3% strikeout rate with a little bit of a concerning 11.8% walk rate on the year, and opponents hit 229 against him overall. But the 0 home runs is 0 home runs. Calvin Fauché of the Marlins, somebody I was kind of interested in the Orioles trading for at the deadline, they ended up not dealing him, was the only other pitcher in baseball to throw at least 31 innings at the major league level this year and not allow a home run. Fauché, also a reliever, a righty, as Pérez is a lefty, but those were the only two who threw that many innings and did not allow a home run. In fact, it's been a long, long time since Pérez has allowed one. He's going to go, even at opening day, almost 2 full calendar years without allowing a long ball. May 31st of 2023 at Oriole Park against the Cleveland Guardians was the last time he allowed a home run. And funny enough, he allowed 2 home runs in that same outing against the Guardians that day. And those were the only 2 home runs he allowed in 53 1/3 innings pitched in 2023. So you go through all of the last 2 seasons, in only 1 outing over the last 2 years has he allowed a homer. It just happened to be a 2-homer kind of big blow-up outing in May of last year. But the streak is 103 consecutive appearances out of the Oriole bullpen and 86 2/3 consecutive innings without allowing a home run. It's the second longest streak in Orioles history, and it's the longest current streak in Major League Baseball. That is very, very impressive. And again, I mentioned he allowed the 2 homers in 2023, both on the same day. He only allowed 2 homers in 2022, and he threw 57 2/3 innings that year and had the crazy 1.40 ERA. He's just someone who is able to repeat because he just gives up so many ground balls and can generally give up soft contact. He's able to hold down home runs. And when you don't give up homers, especially as a reliever, even with a guy with a walk rate pushing 12%, which is a little high, it's really hard to have those big blow up innings. And that's what you want to avoid when you're kind of a middle reliever who's going to be in there every 2 or 3 days. You just want to avoid the blow up outings. Only one time in 2024 did he allow 3 earned runs or more. It was a 3 earned run outing. That's the only time he allowed more than 2 runs. And those I consider the big blow up outings. If you're allowing 3 or more out of the bullpen, you kind of fizzled. He only did that once. And here's the funny thing with Pérez. He's not going to allow any home runs, but he is certainly going to be involved with them. Because the final thing I want to talk about and things that went well for Cionel Pérez this year, he caught 7 home runs in his hat that were hit out to the bullpen. Caught 7 homers. That's like the unofficial count right now out of the air with his hat. Just an absurd thing to do, and was a very, very funny storyline to follow with Perez all season. But it wasn't all glamorous. Again, he posted a 4.53 ERA. Even with bad luck, it's not the most reliable reliever you are going to go to. And first of all, let's turn to what went wrong for Cionel Pérez last season. He started the year with an injury, pitched in one game opening weekend, and then was immediately placed on the injured list with a right oblique strain and did not return until April 29th. So he basically pitched one game and then missed the first month of the season. And you would think, that might throw him off a bit. You have the oblique early, you're coming back from him. But the funny thing was, he came back April 29th. May was actually the best month of his season. So apparently the oblique was pretty much all fixed when he got back, because he was really, really good in May. Although he did have some other months that were kind of tough. And it wasn't because of the home run. As we know, it was because of the walks. And that was really the other big thing that went wrong for Cionel Pérez in 2024. It's that, despite the stuff still looking good, still throwing the hard sinker, opponents hit just 167 with a 31% swing and miss rate against his slider, which he threw basically just as often as his sinker. He threw a lot of solid four-seamers as well. The issue was the walks, and he was having trouble commanding sometimes all three of those pitches. Now, the walks were always an issue earlier in his career. He first debuted with the Astros in 2018 at age 22, pitched for Houston and Cincinnati before coming over to Baltimore on waivers, and he had always had walk issues. And it was something the Orioles kind of corralled when he had that crazy 1.40 ERA season in 2022. He had a 9% walk rate, which is still slightly above league average. Like, I wouldn't call that low. But when you compare it to the fact that he was running walk rates of like 15, 16, 17, 18% in small sample sizes, like the year before, 2021 in Cincinnati, 24 innings that year with the Reds, he walked 20 batters. That is not good. You cannot get along in the majors doing that. But he seemed to corral the issue to a much more playable 9%. But then it went up to 10.9% in 2023. And then it went up again to 11.8% in 2024. Now, he's still not near those astronomical walk numbers he was putting up in Cincinnati and Houston. But a reliever who only has a 19% K rate and pushing a 12% walk rate, that is concerning. You are just allowing too many free base runners. And now he's able to get out of jams because, again, he's an extreme ground ball pitcher who does not give up home runs. A lot of double plays certainly helped out Cionel Pérez this year, but that's just a lot of free base runners. And the interesting point is, there's only one Oriole reliever who had a higher walk rate than Cionel Pérez last year, and it was Craig Kimbrell, who at times was the king of walks out of that Oriole bullpen. He was the only guy worse in that category. But when you think about it, for a pitcher like Pérez, the walks just shouldn't be an issue. And that's why I think it's not really like an approach thing. He's not trying to nibble the corners and is just taking the walks because it happens and moving on. It still seems to be kind of a command and control issue that, even though he's figured some of it out and become a good major league reliever with the Orioles, it feels like those issues are still in there, because when you have good stuff like Pérez does, you're coming out there with a 96 mile per hour sinker, 97 mile per hour four-seamer, good hard 83 mile per hour slider with good break that gets a lot of swings and misses. Like, that is good stuff that he has out there on the mound. And you simply don't allow home runs. You haven't allowed one in your last 103 appearances, and you get a ton of ground balls. That should be a pitcher who should be throwing everything in the strike zone, knowing, hey, I've got 3 pitches that I can use in the zone. I'm not going to give up home runs. I shouldn't be afraid of the big inning. When they put the ball in play, they're going to put it on play in the ground. And hey, it might lead to a lot of singles every once in a while, but more often than not, it's going to get ground ball outs. I'm going to get some strikeouts, and I will be a good reliever. And yet, it's got to be the command issues, because for his package as a pitcher, his goal should be throwing it in the zone as much as possible. He has the stuff to be successful in the zone. He just needs to get there more. And again, he did it in his first year with the Orioles, and it's slacked off a bit the last 2 years. And that's why the ERA has risen so much from 1.4 to in the 3s and now into the 4s in 2024. And it's really about, can he switch that up? And if he can't, he's not going to be able to be the Orioles' go-to lefty if he's still having walk issues. And that may open the door for Gregory Soto? Not to say he doesn't have walk issues, because we'll get to those, but is the door open for Soto in 2025? We'll talk about his half season with the Orioles and what he could bring to this bullpen next season. That is coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Rocket Money. Did Rocket Money help you find any subscriptions you forgot about or that you were paying for twice? Well, that definitely happened to me. I had a few subscriptions that I didn't even realize I was still paying for, and Rocket Money made it so easy to track them all down. It's like having a personal assistant for your finances. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions, monitors your spending, and helps lower your bills so you can grow your savings. It brings everything together in one place, whether it's subscriptions, your spending habits, or even the goals you want to hit this year. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. And for me, I know I have subscriptions that I just need to cancel, but some of them you need to make a phone call to do. I don't want to make that phone call. Rocket Money can take it over and do it for you. So cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That is rocketmoney.com/lockedon. One more time, it's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. So from Cionel Peréz, we move on to Gregory Soto, who hasn't spent nearly as much time with the Orioles, but certainly is fighting for that similar number one lefty relief spot in 2025. And let's start with what went right for Gregory Soto in an Orioles uniform, who, just to catch you up if you missed it, was traded to the Orioles just kind of right before the trade deadline from the Phillies to the O's. The Orioles sent two pitching prospects in Seth Johnson and Moises Chase over to Philadelphia in the deal. Seth Johnson, who had come over previously in the Trey Mancini trade, was kind of stuck on the 40-man roster, coming off Tommy John, wasn't coming along as nicely as the Orioles would have liked. He was still in Double-A Bowie. He was kind of filling up a 40-man spot, so he seemed like a guy who was likely to get traded. Moises Chase, of all the prospects the Orioles traded at the 2024 deadline, Chase has the ability to hurt the most. I think he has the highest upside as a pitcher, got to Double-A with Philly, has really, really good stuff. He got added to the 40-man roster this offseason. That's kind of why the Orioles traded him. They felt like maybe they wouldn't add him to the 40-man, even though he was Rule 5 eligible. We'll see what he can do. I think more so than Norby, more so than Stowers and Seth Johnson and those guys, I think Chase could be the one that hurts the most. But if Soto puts up a big year in 2025, it'll take away some of that sting. And the first thing that went right for Gregory Soto with the Orioles was his finish to the season, because you look at his overall numbers with the O's. Now, in Philly to start the year, 35 and a third innings, a 4.08 ERA, 3.62 FIP. He was a fine reliever, getting strikeouts, getting grounders, walking too many guys. But he comes over to Baltimore, and you look at the full stats, and you say 23 outings, 17 and two-thirds innings, a 5.09 ERA. And you're thinking, oh boy, it must have gone terribly for Gregory Soto in Baltimore. But really, it was kind of three bad outings. And after that, after he had three really rough outings to begin his Orioles career, came over at the deadline, first three outings were each a disaster. And then after that, he was quietly maybe the Orioles' best reliever down the stretch. In his final 20 outings in an Oriole uniform, 16 and a third innings, 2 earned runs allowed. That is a 1.10 ERA. Just 11 hits in that span, with 20 strikeouts to only 4 walks and 2 hit batters, just 1 home run allowed, and a mega elite 61% ground ball rate against him in that stretch. And specifically, I mean, he's known for the power sinker that he throws, but the slider was the thing that worked so well. In September, opponents hit just 125 against Gregory Soto's slider with a 67% swing and miss rate. When opponents swung at his slider in September, 2/3 of the time, they were swinging and missing. That is insanely elite for a whiff rate on any given pitch. Now, that is because he's got electric stuff. Nobody has ever said he's got bad stuff. It's just been command issues at times. The stuff, though, is pretty incredible. You look at what Soto can throw out there. It is we'll say 4-pitch mix. Kind of depends on how you want to look at it here. He has a slider and a sweeper. The sweeper is kind of the bigger slider at 80 miles an hour. The slider itself is kind of the tighter 88 mile an hour, or excuse me, 86 mile an hour pitch. And then you have the sweeper more 82, 83, 84. But it's a sinker at 97, slider at 86, four-seamer at 98, and a sweeper at 84. And the 109 stuff plus with the Orioles, great number overall. 129 on the slider, even better. That's elite. Sinker at 97 miles an hour. Like, yeah, that's you'll take that anytime. And he really didn't use a lot of sweepers or four-seamers down the stretch with the Orioles. The O's said, look, your two best pitches are your tighter slider and your sinker. And he just kind of went to that in the final 2 months. Now, he was tossing in those other pitches from time to time, but you look at his month of September when he was really good. 56% sinkers, 34% sliders, and then he basically threw 8 four-seamers and 6 total sweepers in the final month of the year. Like, he was tossing them in every once in a while, but it was sinker, hard slider, and he went to town with those two pitches. Sinker at 97, slider at 86, and it got a whole lot of outs. And what else did he do? Well, he stopped walking people in an Oriole uniform. I mentioned just the 4 walks in the final 20 outings. Over his final 9 appearances of the year, he walked just 1 batter. You will take that all the time, especially from a guy in Gregory Soto, who his overall walk rate with the Orioles was 9%, but it was sitting at 12.1% with the Phillies before the trade. He kept his strikeout rate the same and dropped his walk rate by over 3% just from going from Philly to Baltimore. That is a super helpful change that he made. I mean, even when he was having all-star seasons back with the Tigers in, you're looking back at 2021 and 2022 when he was great with Detroit, he was posting like 13 and 14% walk rates. That is generally not sustainable. To get it down to 9% where he was with the Orioles, that is really, really good. That's just above league average. With the K rate, again, almost the same. But again, it's that great stuff. Got the walks down, got a bunch of key outs. Like, he had that huge double play he induced in the game where Santander hit the walk-off homer against the Giants late in September to avoid the sweep. When Seranthony Dominguez blew the save in the top of the 9th, Soto came in a possible jam, got a huge double play to keep the game tied, and allowed Santander the chance to hit that walk-off home run. Like, he was coming in some big spots, but things went wrong because before those final 20 outings, there were the first 3 outings for Gregory Soto. And in those first 3 outings as an Oriole, he recorded just 4 outs in 3 outings. That is a inning and a third. 9 hits, 8 earned runs, 1 strikeout, 3 walks, and 1 home run allowed. It was horrendous to watch. And it really kind of set the tone for Orioles fans for Soto's time as an Oriole, when in fact, he kind of wiped that. Brandon Hyde put him in some low leverage spots, rebuilt his confidence, and he was lights out by the end of the year. But those first 3 outings, 0 command. And when you added that to the fact that, hey, they gave up Seth Johnson and Moises Chase, 2 pitching prospects that people liked, that trade was really, really hurting for those first 3 outings. It was not looking great. But again, it was 20 really good ones after the 3 bad ones. Now, the other thing that could concern you with Soto is that he wasn't really that good with the Phillies. Now, the Orioles made some adjustments when he got to Baltimore, and he ended up pitching very well. But 35 and a third innings with the Phillies before the trade, and there was definitely some struggles. He was also kind of publicly upset when Phillies manager Rob Thompson, as the year went on last year, he came over to Philly in a trade in 2023. He was a big part of their bullpen, had some struggles, but overall was pretty good, was a high leverage guy. Because he had so many walk issues, the Phillies were kind of moving him out of high leverage roles for that kind of final month or 2 he was in Philadelphia. And he was pretty openly upset about that. And that made it more and more likely the Phillies were trying to trade him. Now, luckily, the Orioles got it fixed and he was awesome. But if he starts to struggle again and the Orioles move him into some low leverage, does that start to become an issue as it was in Philly? Hopefully not. But it's something you got to bring up and address. That did happen, but he did seem to be a lot happier pitching for the Orioles down the stretch. So those are the cases. Those are the seasons for Perez and Soto. The big question is, who is the more trustworthy left-handed reliever for Brandon Hyde and the Orioles in 2025? Try to answer that to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Game Time. Now, I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. Some of my favorite memories of 2024 was attending Orioles games with tickets. I got a Game Time. The energy and the excitement, it's unforgettable. Well, now Game Time has made it even easier to get tickets for your favorite events with their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Recently, I was looking maybe to see, prices on tickets for Ravens Steelers on Saturday night using the Game Time app. And with Game Time Picks, I found amazing deals. Could even see the view from my seat before buying. Plus, the app's all-in pricing shows the total cost up front. No surprise fees at checkout. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONMLB. That is LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. So we've recapped the season of Cionel Pérez. We've recapped the season of Gregory Soto for the Orioles in 2024. Now the question is, what's the biggest storyline for both of these guys heading into 2025? And it is, which one will be the highest leverage left-handed pitcher? That was, when he was healthy, Danny Coulombe's job. He was that guy. He had a bunch of injury issues this year. The Orioles declined his team option for 2025. He's still a free agent, so it's still possible the Orioles could bring Danny Coulombe back, and I think that's something that realistically still could happen before this offseason is over. But right now, he's not in that bullpen, and so we have to look at Soto and Perez as the top two lefties in there. Now, I wanted to talk about, especially when Coulombe was out, who was getting those big left-handed chances. And it's tough to look at all of it because Coulombe was hurt before Soto came in. But let's just look after the Orioles acquired Gregory Soto in that trade. So let's look at August 1st on. Leverage index for each pitcher from August 1st to the end of the season. 1.0 in this statistic is about average leverage. Anything higher is higher leverage. Anything lower on average is lower leverage. Cionel Pérez, from the time Soto was acquired until the end of the season, was at a 1.17 leverage index according to FanGraphs, which meant on average, he was in higher than normal leverage situations. Gregory Soto was at 0.79, which means in general, he was pitching in more low leverage situations than not overall. However, if you look in just September, it got a little closer. Cionel Pérez dropped to 1.12 and Gregory Soto jumped to 1.01. So Soto was basically pitching in average leverage on average, and Perez came down a little bit in his high leverage outings. But then there was that outing I mentioned on September 19th, Orioles-Giants. Seranthony Dominguez looks terrible in the top of the ninth, can't get anybody out. Gregory Soto comes in and ends up getting a huge double play in the top of the ninth inning to keep the game tied at 3. Santander hits the walk-off homer in the bottom of the ninth to avoid the sweep. Including that game from that point on. So basically the last week and a half of the season when the Orioles were fighting to just make sure they could try to stay in the division race, but mostly at that point, it was just make sure they could secure a playoff spot, get themselves healthy, and get to the postseason. And Brandon Hyde was trying to set up the bullpen to see, okay, I don't have Felix Bautista. I have kind of a tired Yennier Cano. He was getting Danny Coulombe back and Jacob Webb back, but wasn't really sure what they'd be from elbow injuries. Remember, Cano was having forearm issues. There were questions about the bullpen at that point. So Brandon Hyde was trying to figure some things out. From the 19th on to the end of the year, Gregory Soto had a 1.76 leverage index. That led the team. Basically, nobody more often was put into high leverage than Gregory Soto for that last week and a half of the season. Now, Cionel Pérez was at 1.29, so he was being used in leverage spots as well. But Brandon Hyde, for those final 2 weeks of the year, turned to Gregory Soto as his number one left-hander. And I think if we're projecting out, okay, who's going to have the higher leverage spots in 2025, Cionel Pérez or Gregory Soto, I think it's going to be Soto. Now, Pérez did pitch in one postseason game, and Soto did pitch in one postseason game. Now, Pérez was not as good. He gave up a run. Soto did not. It's a one-game sample size. They both pitched in the postseason. Basically, they were trusted enough to do that. Danny Coulombe did as well. But I think it'll be Soto because number one, he just has better stuff. I like Cionel Perez's stuff. Soto's is just better. And usually, over time, that stuff wins out. If you're staying healthy, the stuff will win out. Now, Perez still has good stuff. It's not like he's throwing 92 and Soto's throwing 97. They're both throwing 97 mile per hour sinkers from the left side with good sliders. They're very similar pitchers. So if you think the stuff's going to be similar, which I think Soto's better, but it could be similar, who can command it better? And I got to tell you, if you're taking the full picture, especially of just their time with the Orioles in 2024, I trust Gregory Soto more than Cionel Pérez. Perez's walk rate has been increasing year by year, and it got dangerously high last year, whereas Soto, his has been lowering every year, and the Orioles dropped it way down to basically right around league average, and he, with that, kept his high strikeout rate. He strikes out like 7-8% higher amount of batters than Perez does with a lower walk rate and better stuff. All that stuff is pointing to me and saying, hey, Cionel Pérez is still going to be a big part of this bullpen next year, but I think Soto's role is going to be bigger, and it's nice to have both guys. And maybe the Orioles should add one more lefty reliever. Like, we know Keegan Aiken is in this mix as well. He had a really good 2024 in kind of multiple different roles. I don't think we've broken down his season yet. We'll do that here in the next couple of weeks, but he'll be in this mix as well, but he'll probably have more of a multi-inning kind of role than a late, 8th, 9th inning kind of guy. He got a few of those chances last year, and he probably will as well. And maybe the Orioles should add another lefty. AJ Minter, Tim Hill, guys are still out there that could really help this bullpen from the left side if they don't bring Danny Coulombe back. But I think Soto just fits better with what the Orioles want to do in those late leverage spots for left-handers. Then I guess the other big question for these guys moving forward before we go is, are either of them long-term options? The Orioles did decide to tender a contract to Gregory Soto because he was so good down the stretch, but he is going to be a free agent after 2025. He will hit free agency. Cionel Pérez is going to be a free agent after 2026. The Orioles do have 2 years left of him versus just 1 year left of Soto. Will they stick around long-term? I can't see Mike Elias being a guy who really does give out extensions to so far anybody, but especially not relief pitchers because they're the most volatile and risky of any position on the baseball field. And Elias showed he could get a Cionel Pérez on waivers. He could get a Soto via trade, and he feels maybe he could find another one like Luis Gonzalez, the lefty who the Orioles had in AAA last year and they added to the 40-man roster this year. I think they believe that Luis Gonzalez could be the next one of these guys who comes up and is a really good lefty out of the Oriole bullpen. There could be others. Maybe the way for Trevor Rogers to get back on this roster is he is put in the bullpen as a weapon this year. That's certainly a possibility for the 2025 Orioles. I would doubt that Soto is an Oriole beyond this year. There's a chance that Cionel Pérez could get dealt next offseason. I doubt he's an Oriole beyond 2026. But if one of them really starts to show out and get the walk rate down and show that good stuff, maybe they could be brought back. I think they're more of short-term answers, as most relievers are. But the fight between the two of them for that number one spot, because they're such similar pitchers, not in stature at all. Cionel Pérez is listed at 6 feet tall. Can we talk about that? Cionel Pérez is not 6 feet tall. Gregory Soto is listed at 6'1", 234. Cionel Pérez listed at 6 foot 175. Cionel Pérez is not 6 feet tall. All right, I'm just going to put that out there. They're very different body types, but with similar stuff, it's going to be very interesting to watch the two of them at the back end of the Oriole bullpen in 2025. But let me know in the comments. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube channel. Make sure to leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you listen, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever. It all really helps out the pod tremendously. Let me know here in the YouTube comments, who do you trust more in the Oriole bullpen in 2025 to be that top lefty, Cionel Pérez or Gregory Soto? But that'll do it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll be back on Friday for one more podcast this week. If we have a Anthony Santander signing elsewhere, I might kind of break that down and do a little look back on his time with the O's. Might also have some Orioles rumors, some news and notes to get to. Of course, we'll have it all covered on Friday's pod. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.